first thing you need to understand about humans is that they don't quit. Ever. Even when quitting is the only logical option. Even when mathematics, probability, and basic survival instinct scream at them to run. They just don't. And I learned this the hard way on Ridge 793. And I'm a combat analyst for the Galactic Coalition's 5th Expeditionary Force. My job is to watch battles unfold and explain to the generals why we are winning or losing. Technical work, clean work. The kind of work where you sit in an observation pod 3,000 meters above the action, sipping recycled water and taking notes. And that particular morning started like any other disaster. The Kravik had punched through our defensive line on the northern continent of Helios Prime. And for those unfamiliar with the Kravik, imagine if someone took a bear, made it 12 feet tall, gave it armor plating that could shrug off plasma fire, and then made it really, really angry about everything. We had 2,000 coalition troops holding that ridge, good soldiers too, Vexillian shock troopers, Minari sharpshooters, even a company of Phyrexian heavy weapons specialists, the cream of the crop, while the Kravik had 20,000 coming up that hill. General Korvox's voice crackled through my comm unit, sounding exhausted. And after 6 months of fighting on Helios Prime, that exhaustion showed in everyone. And when I ran the tactical projections, I told him our line would collapse in 47 minutes, and recommended immediate evacuation, which he approved. And that should have been the end of it, a standard retreat. Except I noticed one human signature still on the ridge, not moving toward evacuation, just sitting at the highest point of the defensive line. That human was Sergeant First Class Danny Ror, Earth Military, Combat Engineer, 14 years of active combat, dozens of engagements, dozens of commendations, and a long list of reprimands for disobeying orders. A man who had once held off an entire assault company using improvised explosives and aggressive profanity. When ordered to evacuate, he simply declined, explaining that where he came from, you evaluate an order and ignore it if it's stupid. And when told he would be overrun, he calmly stated that the ridge was extremely defensible for him, because he wasn't planning to defend it the way we thought about defense. What followed was 7 hours of something I still struggle to describe, as Ror turned that ridge into a killing ground, having mined the approaches with custom explosives, built underground bunkers, set up overlapping kill zones, and modified heavy weapons so he could operate them alone, wiping out wave after wave of Kravik with terrifying precision. He wasn't defending. He was hunting, adapting constantly, studying their patterns, herding them into traps, and dismantling an army one calculated choice at a time. By the time the enemy had committed over 8,000 troops against a single human and still failed, General Korvox realized something profound. That humans don't care about projections, odds, or mathematical certainty, and ordered a counterattack, which succeeded largely because Ror had broken the enemy's momentum and morale. One human had held a ridge against 20,000, and turned a certain defeat into a major victory. When I finally met him, he shrugged it off, saying he was just stubborn and tired of running, and that someone had to stand. And later, I wrote a report stating that humans don't see impossible situations the way we do. They don't see mathematics. They see challenges, and when they decide something matters, they make the universe bend around that decision. That report became required reading, and what happened next only reinforced it, because humans went on to dismantle a massive Kravik supply nexus, with only 500 volunteers, using sabotage, psychological warfare, and chaos instead of conventional assault, causing tens of thousands of enemies to surrender with minimal human casualties. The war began to turn everywhere humans were deployed, not because they were stronger or more numerous, but because they solved problems in ways no one else would even consider. Eventually, 12 humans walked into the Kravik capital and negotiated an end to the war, not through threats, but through calm certainty backed by an established reputation for doing the impossible. After decades of studying them, I still can't fully quantify what makes humans so effective. But I know this: they don't quit. They don't surrender, and they don't accept that anything is truly impossible. And when the universe says no, humans say, "Watch me." And that is why the last human on the ridge was the only one needed. And why, when hope is gone and logic demands retreat, the smartest thing you can do is call a human. Humans don't fight because they are fearless. They fight because they decide something is worth more than their fear. And once that decision is made, nothing else really matters. Not pain, not exhaustion, not odds, not even survival. And that realization changed everything about how I viewed warfare and existence itself. After Ridge 793 and Operation Bedlam, the coalition quietly began restructuring entire doctrines around one simple concept. Whenever humans were involved, traditional predictions were unreliable. Strategies that should have failed worked. Offensives that should have collapsed succeeded. And defensive positions that should have been abandoned became unbreakable. I spent years traveling between fronts, observing human units in action, watching them improvise solutions in real time, turning scrap into weapons, terrain into traps, and hopeless situations into opportunities. And every single time, the pattern was the same. They refused to accept the story the universe was telling them. Other species asked, "Can this be done?" Humans asked, "How can this be done?" And that difference reshaped the war. Sergeant Danny Ror eventually became Major Danny Ror, then an instructor at the Coalition War College, where he taught not formulas or rigid doctrine, but mindset, adaptability, and creative disobedience. And I attended one of his lectures out of curiosity. A young officer asked him how he knew his insane plans would work. And Ror simply said he didn't. He just knew they might. And for humans, a chance is enough, because if there is even a small opening, they will pry it open with everything they have. He explained that humans are not the strongest, smartest, or longest-lived species, but they are the best at refusing to accept limits, and that refusal is their true weapon. The galaxy eventually stabilized, borders were redrawn, alliances formed, and the Kravik became uneasy partners instead of enemies. But the legend of Ridge 793 never faded. The ridge was turned into a memorial, and visitors from dozens of species came to stand where one human had decided that retreat was unacceptable. I returned there several times myself, standing in silence, remembering the thermal scan that showed a single unmoving dot on a ridgeline, and realizing that dot had represented something far larger than one soldier. It represented a truth about humanity that numbers can't capture. Humans are cooperative when they have choices, stubborn when challenged, and terrifying when cornered. They will try diplomacy first, compromise second, and only reach for violence when everything else fails. But when they do, they commit completely. They don't half fight, they don't half believe, and they don't half commit. They either walk away or go all in. And once they go all in, stopping them becomes nearly impossible. I used to believe the most dangerous thing in the universe was a massive fleet or a superweapon. I was wrong. The most dangerous thing is a human who has decided that something matters, because that human will bend rules, break expectations, and rewrite outcomes. They will stand alone if they have to. They will try and fail and try again. They will turn loss into lesson and lesson into victory. So when future officers ask me what they should remember about humans, I give them a simple answer. Humans don't quit. They don't give up when they should. They don't surrender when it makes sense. And in a universe where most beings are governed by probability, logic, and caution, a species that refuses to be bound by any of those is nothing short of revolutionary. And even now, long after the war has ended and the front lines have turned into trade routes and memorial corridors, I still find myself cataloguing stories about humans, because they never stopped doing impossible things. They just stopped calling them impossible. They build colonies on worlds everyone else labeled uninhabitable. They repair ships that should be scrap. They survive crashes that should be fatal. And when asked how, they usually shrug and say the same thing. We figured it out. To humans, figuring it out is not a miracle. It is an expectation. I once interviewed a human medic who had stayed behind during an evacuation to treat wounded from 3 different species, knowing full well the enemy was minutes away. When I asked why he hadn't left, he looked genuinely confused and said, because they were bleeding, as if no further explanation was required. That simplicity, that brutal clarity of purpose, is another part of what makes humans so dangerous and so valuable. When they see suffering, they act. When they see injustice, they push back. When they see a wall, they start looking for cracks. Other species often mistake human stubbornness for recklessness. But after years of observation, I believe it is something else entirely. It is an internal refusal to accept a reality they find unacceptable. Humans do not merely react to the universe, they argue with it. They treat fate like a poorly written suggestion, and then proceed to rewrite it. There is a phrase in several human languages that roughly translates to, not today, and I have heard it spoken in situations where death seemed unavoidable. It is never shouted with heroism, never delivered like a grand speech. It is usually muttered, sometimes even joked, but it carries more weight than any formal declaration of war. Not today means the human has decided the universe is wrong, and that decision alone changes everything. So when historians of the future try to summarize why humanity became one of the most influential species in the galaxy, they will talk about industry, technology, population growth, and strategic alliances. But all will know the simpler truth. Humanity rose not because they were destined to, not because they were superior, but because they kept standing up when logic said they should stay down. The last human on the ridge was never really just one human. He was every human who ever refused to accept an ending they didn't agree with. He was every human who ever said, there has to be another way. He was proof that sometimes the smallest force in the equation is will, and sometimes will is the only force that actually matters. And if the universe ever finds itself in another crisis, another war, another impossible scenario where all projections end in defeat, I already know what will happen. Someone, somewhere, will look toward humanity and say, ask the humans. Because deep down, every species now understands what I learned on Ridge 793. When everything is on the line, when hope is nearly gone, when surrender seems reasonable, humans will still be standing. Cracked, exhausted, wounded, but standing. And standing does not always look heroic. Most of the time it looks messy, loud, imperfect, and painfully human. It looks like shaking hands, reloading a weapon, like tired eyes scanning the dark, like someone whispering to themselves just to stay awake one more minute. Humans do not persist because they are fearless. They persist because they are afraid and move forward anyway. That is another misunderstanding many species have. They assume bravery means the absence of fear. Humans know better. Humans define bravery as action in spite of fear. I have seen humans scream, cry, curse, and still charge into danger. I have seen them joke about their own deaths while building explosives. I have seen them argue over trivial things minutes before battle, and then step in front of each other without hesitation when the shooting started. Humans are contradictions wrapped in flesh and bone. They are compassionate and violent, gentle and ruthless, hopeful and cynical, often at the same time. But beneath all those contradictions is one consistent trait. They do not like being told they cannot do something. Tell a human a task is impossible, and you have just given them motivation. On more than one occasion, I watched human commanders deliberately choose plans with lower survival odds, simply because those plans had even a small chance of saving others. When I questioned this logic, the answer was always some variation of, if there's a chance, we take it. To humans, a 1% chance is not zero, and 0 is the only number they truly accept as impossible. Long after the war, I was asked to help design a universal threat assessment scale for the coalition. Most species were categorized by feat strength, industrial output, or technological level. Humans broke the model. No matter what numbers we use, they never fit cleanly. Eventually, a human advisor suggested a new metric. Not population, not ships, not weapons. Determination. How far a species is willing to go when pushed. Humans scored off the chart. That chart is now displayed in every major coalition command center. New officers study it, argue about it, and eventually accept it. They learn that humans are not dangerous because they seek war. Humans are dangerous because they refuse to lose. So when people ask me what I truly believe after everything I have seen, after all the battles, all the analysis, all the reports and projections, I give them an answer that is not very scientific, but it is honest. If the universe ever puts its back against the wall, humanity will push back harder, not because they are destined heroes, not because they are special in some cosmic sense, but because giving up simply is not in their nature. They will keep trying, they will keep failing, and eventually, inevitably, they will find a way. And when they finally do find that way, they rarely celebrate it the way other species expect. There are no grand declarations, no galaxy-wide speeches about destiny fulfilled. Most of the time, a human solution is followed by a tired nod, a dark joke, and someone asking where they can get a cup of coffee. To humans, survival is not a miracle. It is a responsibility. I once asked Major Ror if he ever thought about how many lives he had saved, how many worlds had avoided destruction because of his actions. He considered the question for a long moment, and then said, "I mostly think about the ones I couldn't save." That answer unsettled me more than any battlefield footage. Humans do not measure themselves by victories alone. They measure themselves by effort. Did they try hard enough? Did they do everything they could? If the answer is yes, they move forward. If the answer is no, they carry it with them and let it shape who they become. This creates a strange effect in human culture. Failure does not end a story. It becomes the first chapter of the next attempt. Defeat is treated as data. Pain is treated as instruction. Loss is treated as fuel. Other species seek perfection. Humans seek progress. Over time, I began to notice that humans rarely ask, "Will we win?" Instead, they ask, "What's the next step?" That mindset keeps them moving even when the destination is unclear. Step by step, problem by problem, they grind impossible situations into manageable ones. That is why the legend of the last human on the ridge endures, not because he was invincible, not because he was superhuman, but because he embodied something deeply ordinary among humans. He saw a problem, he decided it mattered, and he refused to walk away. If you strip away the armor, the weapons, the ranks, and the myth, a human will stand between what they care about and whatever threatens it. They might fall, they might fail, but they will stand first. And in a universe full of ancient empires, godlike technologies, and forces beyond comprehension, that simple act of standing is still one of the most powerful things I have ever witnessed.